Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our special briefing on recent developments in Mongolian politics. Today's briefing is titled Changing of the Court, Mongolia's Recent Political Reforms. For those of you who have attended other events of ours in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the US-Asia Institute, thank you for joining us today. We know you are all very busy and appreciate the time that you are taking out of your day to learn more about Mongolia and its politics. My name is David Hessen, and I am a program assistant at the US-Asia Institute. And for a little bit of background, the US-Asia Institute is a nonpartisan United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping notes. First, I want to give a special thanks to the supporters of for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for making this program possible: the Sands, Shein, FedEx, AIG, ConocoPhillips, Fairfield Maxwell, and Walmart. And then for the layout of this briefing, Ambassador Campbell will give roughly a 20-minute presentation followed by our discussion. And then the last 15 minutes or so, there will be time for questions from the audience. If you have a question you would like us to address, please type it in the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me if you prefer. If you're calling in by phone, you can email usai@usasiainstitute.org with your question. So jumping right in, today we'll provide an overview of Mongolia's political system, recent changes to its presidential and parliamentary systems, and how these changes could impact Mongolia's politics, democracy, and international relations moving forward. For a little bit of background, I just want to go over Mongolia's political history and how we got to this point. So after achieving independence from China in 1911, Mongolia quickly came under the influence of the Soviet Union and functioned as a Soviet communist satellite state for almost 70 years. By the late 1980s, the communist government followed the Soviet Union in enacting some political and economic reforms. And in 1990, a democratic protest movement gained popular support and began to press for the reform of the government. The communist authorities, concerned with the ongoing collapse of the Soviet Union and aware of China's own crackdown of protesters the previous year, were unwilling to stamp out protesters and peacefully permitted political reform. In the decades after, Mongolia, with some assistance from international partners, but largely through their own efforts, built a genuine liberal democratic system of government in the form of a semi-presidential system with powers split between the parliament and the president. However, there are still several key challenges that remain in Mongolia's political system, most notably corruption, the mixed state of independence of the judiciary, and power struggles between the presidency and the parliament. To resolve these issues, Mongolia has gone through several iterations of political reform, the most recent being new constitutional reforms in 2021 that changed the presidency from one term of 6 years instead of 2 terms of 4 years. Further reforms are being considered now that would alter the electoral system of the parliament. So with that basic, very brief overview of how we got here, let me turn it over to our featured speaker. So Ambassador Piper Campbell served as the chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Ulaanbaatar from 2012 to 2015, during which she supported negotiations on the development of Mongolia's extractive industries and agreement on a $350 million U.S.-Mongolia Millennium Challenge Compact. Ambassador Campbell then retired from the State Department in April 2019 with the rank of Minister Counselor after a distinguished 30-year diplomatic career. Currently Administrative Director for the U.S. Foreign Policy and Global Governance Programs, as well as the ASEAN Study Initiative, Ambassador Piper Campbell began teaching at American University in January 2020. She has also taught national security strategy at the National Defense University's National War College, and she holds a degree from Georgetown University and a master's of public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the ambassador for her remarks. Ambassador, please.
Thank you so much, David. And most of all, thank you to the US Asia Institute for deciding to hold a session on Mongolia, a country which is close to my heart and one which I love to talk about. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity and really pleased to see that we have so many people participating. I'm going to try to be brief and somewhat provocative in my remarks, hoping that that will generate some really interesting conversation, David, between you and I, and then even when we open it up to the broader participation. I kind of want to group my thoughts into, or my discussion into, three baskets. And I want to go back a bit, David, to the period you were mentioning, the early 1990s, what Mongolians refer to as their decision for democracy. And I think it's really important to acknowledge how that framing, how many important concepts are sort of included in that framing of it was a Mongolian decision. This is something that was very grassroots, which began with Mongolians assembling peaceful demonstrations in the middle of the winter in one of the coldest countries in the world, where these daily demonstrations just grew and grew. You had students, you had workers, and then you had the politicians themselves joining the demonstration and saying that it was time for Mongolia's system of government to change. It was time for Mongolia's reliance on the Soviet Union, the Russian system, to change. And so for Mongolians, the nature of their transition to a democratic system is really sort of part of their foundational story. And I think that's something that's both very important to understand and also, sadly, highlights a couple aspects of why democracy in Mongolia has a certain fragility to it. Because this Mongolian decision for democracy was founded on, among other things, a rejection of the status quo. So it was very much a frustration boiling up among the Russian population, a frustration boiling up among the Mongolian population, a frustration with the Russian influence, a frustration with the Mongolian government, and a demand for change. And a sense, but really sort of, I think, an inchoate sense, not a well-developed sense among the population, that a democratic system would give them more freedoms, more ability to choose on an individual basis. And to understand how important that is for Mongolians, I think you have to sort of go further back into Mongolia's history and recognize the prideful nature of a country which still recalls with significant, still places significant importance on their ancestor Genghis Khan, on the time frame of the Mongolian Empire, on the fact that although yes, they had a period where they were under Chinese domination, there also was a period of time when Mongolians ruled China. And so a country with a significant pride in their history, a country where individuals in the country have a strong and individualistic sense, a nomadic country where people really rely on themselves and their family unit and expect to rely on themselves and their family unit for much of what they need. And so this Mongolian decision for democracy was a demand for freedoms. It was a demand for more. It was a demand for different. It was not necessarily a sophisticated demand for a multi-party liberal political system. And so we see after this demand for democracy, we see the Mongolian process of writing constitution. And that process was not one which had that same organic sense to it. I've actually just recently been reading an excellent book by Thomas Ricks about the process by which America's founding fathers debated different principles as they, and we all know so many of these stories about the conflict among the founding fathers, the conflicts that had to be sort of resolved in our Constitution. There wasn't really a discussion or a process like that which occurred in Mongolia in the 1990s. And therefore I would say that two of these sort of foundational challenges for Mongolian democracy actually emerge from that point. The first is that I would say that concept of civic responsibility, which the American founding fathers referred to as virtue, this idea, and not virtue as in terms of a moral standing, but more virtue in terms of this idea that leaders of a country would put the interests of the country above the interests of their political party or their self-interests, that was such a foundational concept in American democracy. I'm not saying that that idea doesn't exist in Mongolia, but I'm saying that was not a foundational concept of establishing the Mongolian democracy. And so I know that we'll talk about corruption during the session. We'll talk about some of the weaknesses in the checks and balances between the parliamentary system, the judicial system, which has come so much under the influence of the main political party, the Mongolian People's Party. And we'll talk about the imbalance right now between the presidency and parliament. But I would assert that many of the problems in those areas with corruption and the imbalance among the organs of the Mongolian system date back to this founding moment where Mongolians chose democracy, but they chose democracy with a focus on individual freedoms as opposed to a focus on a democratic system of governance. That's point one. Point two would be, I would assert that there's a certain quandary that many Mongolians face between wanting the most possible freedom for individuals. And that would be another thing that would resonate with many Americans, where we are so clear and we have such strong discourse even in the United States about individual freedoms and what individual rights are. Those sorts of debates go on in Mongolia as well. There is a strong expectation that the individual will be allowed to do much of what they want to do. At the same time, and I think in a way this is a holdover from the period of Soviet influence, there is an expectation that the state is going to both be kind of decisive and kind of the authoritative as opposed to consultative, and an expectation that the state's going to take care of you. So one of the things that often struck me when I was ambassador, and I should note that it's actually 10 years ago that I first arrived, almost 10 years ago today, that I arrived in Mongolia. One of the things that surprised me the most was the nostalgia in the countryside and especially among older Mongolians, nostalgia for the Soviet period. And so this seems incompatible with this pride in the decision for democracy. But among the people in the countryside, many regret the loss of some of the social services and some of the assurances that they feel that they had under the Soviet system. And so even in 2012, even in 2022, there is a certain sympathy for the Russians, a sense of the Russians as brothers, so a sense of cultural connection to the Russians, as well as a sense of historical connection with the Russians, and again, I'll use the word again, a nostalgia for this remembered, imagined past where things were a little easier, maybe a little more predictable. And so for people of that generation, and again, we talk especially about rural populations, there is a feeling that some of the changes in this rapidly growing country with what was, when I arrived in 2012, the fastest growing economy in the world, that the country is changing. People are moving to the capital city. More than half of the population of Mongolia actually resides in or around the capital city of Ulaanbaatar. And the countryside feels left behind, left out, and feels concerned by that. So that's just to sort of start the conversation with kind of two big picture looks at some of the things that, I would say right now are tearing at the fabric of Mongolia's democratic system. And then I'm going to fast forward to 2020. So almost 2 years ago now, almost exactly 2 years ago now, remembering that at that point we were right in the middle of the COVID epidemic. Mongolia at that time seemed to be doing better than many of its neighbors. The government had a prompt and I'd say pretty progressive, pretty expansive response, to COVID. And so, people were the electorate was pretty positive about the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Khurelsukh, and about his party, the Mongolian People's Party. And so in summer of 2020, when the Mongolian people went to their election, a presidential election as well as a parliamentary election, it wasn't surprising necessarily it absolutely wasn't surprising that the Mongolian People's Party, the MPP, fared very well in that election. It was, however, and I'll explain to you two reasons why it wasn't surprising. The first was that the Mongolian People's Party, which had been in control of parliament in the period as they were establishing the rules in 2019 for the 2020 election, had taken a number of decisions which really set themselves up to be better positioned to win the 2020 election. And there's pretty well and strongly documented concern about steps that the party had taken to weaken the judiciary, to arrest a number of candidates during the election season, and also to change some of the basic rules of in terms of districting and in terms of the voting system for the election. All of those things increased the size of districts, shifted power to the rural areas that tend to be more soundly in the camp of the Mongolian People's Party, as opposed to its primary opposition, the Democratic Party. So the MPP and the DP are the two largest political parties in Mongolia. And the steps that the Mongolian People's Party had taken in 2019 had really strengthened their position going into the election. So you have a government that was in pretty good shape for having had a strong and positive response to COVID. You had a government which had taken a number of steps to essentially redraw the political map, both literally the electoral map, but also the systems for voting in ways which favored themselves. And the other thing is that the Democratic Party was sort of fracturing from within. And so you had a pull towards the Mongolian People's Party, and you had a withering of the Democratic Party. The then Prime Minister Ukhna Khurelsukh was elected in the summer of 2020 to be president, and the Mongolian People's Party had a landslide victory. They secured 62 of the 76 seats in parliament. The Democratic Party, the DP, came a distant second. They won only 11 seats. Now, a more interesting figure, so we're talking about 62 versus 11. 62 seats won by the Mongolian People's Party, 11 seats won by the Democratic Party. If I asked you, if you were students in my class and I asked you, okay, what percent of the vote do you think the MPP got for their 62 seats? I'm guessing that you'd come up with a number that was well above 50%. And you'd sort of think that somebody should get 70, 80% of the vote to secure 62 seats out of 76, right? But interestingly, the Mongolian People's Party actually only won 45% of the popular vote. The Democratic Party, with only 11 seats, remember, won 25% of the vote. So you can already start to see how the allocation in Parliament was not at that point representative of the split within the population. And that was the case in 2020. And steps that the Mongolian People's Party has taken in Parliament and with President Hrosuk now in presidency, and also the Prime Minister as well, belonging to the same party, have really strengthened the sense among many Mongolians and many observers of us moving towards something that's close to a one-party state. That is extremely problematic for Mongolia. I think some of these tendencies that I was describing in terms of individual focus on independence, a sort of expectation of a government that's going to deliver services and be a bit autocratic, a bit populist, also sort of feed into an environment where having one party which is so much stronger than the others is particularly problematic. And so those are some of the ways I'd sort of just frame our conversation. And I look forward, David, now to perhaps a bit of a back and forth, and then we hopefully can bring in the audience as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that framework. I think that's very helpful and crucial for moving us forward. I guess, jump into one question. Mongolia has frequently been, I guess, struggling, maybe is the best word, to figure out the right balance between its mineral industry, its partnerships with international mining companies, to ensure that these agreements are transparent, that they're reached fairly, and that the proceeds of this mineral extraction is properly brought to the Mongolian people. So I guess my first question is just, with this political turnover, both between political parties, and also you mentioned this unresolved kind of non-consultative process when the Constitution was being drafted. If these political reforms are making the process of reaching more equitable agreements between the government and mining companies and the people of Mongolia more transparent or more difficult, and how that seems to be playing out.
So one of the most interesting things, looking back at the 2020 election and also looking forward to 2024, when the next parliamentary elections will be, one of the interesting things was how close the platforms of the Mongolian People's Party and Democratic parties sounded. And so if you were to ask, okay, what are the major differences in approach between these two parties? What would the electorate get from voting one way versus the other? It would be really hard to answer that question based on the party platforms. Both of the parties have stressed that, so Oyu Tolgoi is a copper mine in the southern half of the country, which is the primary driver of the Mongolian economy. There are other mines and there's other aspects of the economy, but copper and specifically this copper mine is one of the primary drivers of the economy. And so there is a concern, as you were noting, among the population that the distribution of wealth emanating from the profit from the copper mine is not being distributed fairly between Rio Tinto, which is the primary partner of the government of Mongolia in development of this mine, and that the profits which are accruing to Mongolia are not being distributed appropriately within the country. So that is a concern among the population, and it is one of the things that animates Mongolian politics. And yet, at the same time, if you were to look at the Mongolian People's Party or the Mongolian Democratic Party, you would not see a strong example of, or you wouldn't come up with a strong picture of a difference in approach between the two parties. And so I think what you've got with the sort of lack of certainty that we see because of the evolving political situation in Mongolia is that the three things are happening. I think people do not feel well served by their political parties, and so there is greater popular dissatisfaction in Mongolia. And that would be true especially among younger Mongolians. And I think we'll be able to talk about things like Ukraine and other aspects of what's going on as the conversation continues. But you have this sense of, among the Mongolian population, that the political parties don't necessarily represent them or their desires. You've got Rio Tinto, which is being asked to continue to maintain a huge investment in the country, and which struggles to find the officials with whom it can work in a collaborative and transparent way in terms of making decisions that need to be made over a long-term horizon. And when you've got quite rapid turnover, that can be difficult for a long-term investment, obviously. And then the third aspect of this is that some of the external donors and other countries that want to engage with Mongolia, I think, have a little less confidence in engaging with Mongolia because of some of these perceptions about concern about the direction of the democracy. I should note two things. The first is that UN Secretary General Guterres is actually in Mongolia right now, as far as I understand, having a very positive visit. And Guterres has really stressed throughout his visit how other countries continue to see Mongolia as this beacon of being a vibrant democracy in a tough neighborhood, and a country which has contributed UN peacekeepers, has contributed to UN development. And so while I'm sort of expressing concern about some aspects of Mongolia's democratic system right now, at the same time, it is also, there are so many important aspects of Mongolia's democracy and so many things that I know the United States and other supporters of Mongolia want to see strengthen, want to see come through in the best possible way. But just a few days before UN Secretary General Guterres was in Mongolia, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also was visiting. And so, we continue to see Mongolia sort of pulled in many directions.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up the other countries, because that's where I actually want to head next. So this is a bit of a two-parter question, but I guess the first part would be, with these political tensions and reforms going on in Mongolia first, how do Mongolia's neighbors, China and Russia, and its third neighbors, such as the United States and Japan, South Korea, and so forth, How do these countries view Mongolia's internal politics and reforms, if they have, significant opinions about those?
Mhm.
And then the second part is, if you could maybe just go in a little bit more detail to the extent in the past that the United States, as an advocate for democracy internationally, what the United States has done working with Mongolia in the past on some of these democratic governance issues.
So in terms of Mongolia's relations of course, we all know Mongolia is a landlocked country, and a country with only two neighbors, China to the north, Russia to the south. Excuse me, Russia to the north, China to the south. And Mongolia has always needed to pay close attention to its neighbors' political, security, and economic interests. And Mongolia has always understood that its economy and its political security are shaped by its geographic environment. But you referenced the third neighbor policy, and so this is a policy of saying we need to get along with our neighbors. And at times, obviously, Russia and China have been misaligned. And during those periods of time, then Mongolia's primary challenge was to understand Russia's interests, understand China's interests, and be sure that Mongolia was advancing its own interests in a way that displayed awareness of Russian and Chinese concerns. But the other part of Mongolia's long-term political strategy has been to say, in addition to these two neighbors that we do have, that we can look more broadly, and we can say there's other countries with which we wish we were neighbors. And so that was the development of what is widely called the third neighbor policy. And so that is the guiding star by which Mongolia reaches out and has worked very hard to have a positive relationship with Japan, with South Korea, Australia, with the United States, with Canada. And the United States has been very happy, a strong and supportive neighbor, third neighbor of Mongolia. And I think we see whether it's in the visits of senior Americans. I actually remember speaking with then Vice President Biden about his fond memories of his visit to Mongolia and the horse he had the opportunity to name. So whether it's with senior visits both ways, hosting Mongolians in the United States, senior Americans visiting Mongolia, whether it's with programs like the Millennium Challenge Compact that you mentioned, and the United States has had 2 compacts with Mongolia, whether it's in the area of military cooperation, which has been quite strong between the United States and Mongolia. But I'll actually use military cooperation to answer a little bit of the other part of your question, because Russia, a few months ago, began insinuating that the United States and Mongolia had made an agreement to move forward, incorrectly insinuating, I should stress from the beginning, that the United States and Mongolia had made an agreement to move forward with some sort of mysterious defense biology lab. And this was absolutely not true. And the Mongolian foreign minister, after sort of trying to ignore these insinuations coming out in Russian newspapers, actually felt the need to make a formal statement earlier this spring that the United States and Mongolia had not taken any sort of decision, that we have very strong security cooperation, but that we weren't looking at anything like that. And I think that small anecdote illustrates some of the concerns that Mongolia has been feeling right now as they look at Russian actions in Ukraine, as they come under pressure from the Russians to actually voice support for the Russian position. And they have actively avoided voicing support. They have, in fact, eventually, almost a week and a half after the Russian invasion, they eventually voiced support for the Ukrainian position. They abstained, which is not as good as supporting calls for Russia to pull out of Ukraine, but it's certainly better than if they had not voted in support of those resolutions. So the Mongolians have been walking they've been walking a very thin line these days as they come under economic pressure from China. And as China and Russia appear to be more and more politically aligned, that actually makes things harder for Mongolia.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will throw in one more quick question. We are getting a lot of questions in the chat, so for everyone contributing questions, thank you so much. And if you have any others, please feel free. But I guess my last question is, you mentioned the tensions between the different segments of the population regarding, electoral outcomes and one party overwhelmingly dominating the government, even though the difference in votes is not maybe necessarily, to our eyes, significant enough to justify that outcome. And we've seen elsewhere in the world an upswing in political violence. Unfortunately, I mean, you've seen that in Sri Lanka earlier this year. You saw that in the United States the previous year. And Mongolia is unfortunately not unknown to that either. I read about the electoral riots in 2008 that, swept the capital city. So I guess my question then would be, with things increasingly unsettled and tensions rising, what does it look like? I mean, is political violence or a return to political violence seen as a significant concern, or is that as a method of expressing discontent, is that passed in Mongolia today?
So I think the greater concern is with this slow and gradual eroding of checks and balances, the slow and gradual eroding of a multi-party system, more than it is a concern about political violence in Mongolia. I want to say that I am optimistic about Mongolia's future. I do not expect, nor do I worry over much about political violence in Mongolia, as compared to Sri Lanka or other places in the world that I can think about that. So that is not my primary concern with Mongolia. I think another interesting point that we didn't touch on is how many small and independent parties there are. And so it's more, my concerns are around the fracturing of the system more than they are about a downfall into violence.
Okay, thank you for that. With that, we will turn over to questions from the audience. So the first question we have, I think we touched on this a little bit as far as Russia is concerned, but is the political situation in Mongolia generally affected by political turbulence in its closed neighbor countries, such as the post-Soviet Central Asian republics?
I'm also noticing that Wallace Stanfield corrected me on the timing of the presidential election. So thank you very much for that. I'm mortified. The parliamentary election was indeed in 2020 and the presidential election was 2021. So thank you for that. So in terms of the political situation in Mongolia, it is impacted by pressure from Russia and China, much more so than the situation in other countries in the area. When I first went to serve in Mongolia, my expectation was that having served previously in Asia would help me understand the situation in Mongolia. But I rapidly found that the past experience that helped me the most in Mongolia was actually having served previously in the former Yugoslavia. And I mentioned that in the space of saying that Mongolia is unique. And its situation during the Soviet period was so different from the situation in the Soviet republics that we don't really look at Mongolia and compare it to, say, a Kazakhstan or a former Soviet republic. The political systems, the expectations of people, the Western looking population that you have in Mongolia is very different from what you see in, I wouldn't even say in other parts of Central Asia, because I really don't think of Mongolia as being being in Central Asia. So I would say no.
All right, and then the next one touches on freedom of the press in Mongolia. So the question is just, what is the situation with freedom of the press in Mongolia, and do people and journalists have rights to speak and criticize the government freely, or are they more repressed in a manner similar to perhaps some of their neighbors?
So we've been concerned about judicial independence in Mongolia, but less so about press independence. Mongolia has a large number of newspapers. Social media is vibrant. There are journalists who are widely followed and are quite regularly and comfortably critical of the government, critical of many of the same sorts of things that I was discussing so far. So the situation of the media in Mongolia is significantly better than in Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or China, which isn't to say that there aren't some areas of concern. And I noted that there'd been candidates arrested around the time of the 2020 election. We have seen some instances of what's felt like media censorship or media self-censorship. There's also a concern that much of the media is actually aligned with, or in some cases owned by, various politicians. And so it can be difficult. It's the challenge in the media environment in Mongolia is primarily finding reliable sources and sifting between very differing views expressed in the media.
Okay. We have another question talking about the Mongolian People's Party. And the question is essentially, how has China's influence, I suppose, recently been felt by the Mongolian population, and how has the Mongolian People's Party's electoral success been viewed in China recently?
The Mongolian People's Party is seen more closely as a former communist party, is seen more closely to be aligned with Russia than it is aligned with China. And in general, I would not say that the Democratic Party or the Mongolian Party, Mongolian People's Party, the DP or the MP, are neither one nor the other are necessarily seen as being more closely aligned to China.
Yeah, I would agree. We have a more of an economic and corruption question here, saying that in 2021, Mongolia implemented a program called e-Mongolia, which digitized its public services and enrolled 2 million users, which, as we previously discussed, is massive for a country of about 3 million.
5, yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, do you think technology like this could aid in the transparency and corruption in Mongolia today?
Yes, absolutely. And e-commerce, what are called, a single user window, so mechanisms by which the consumer can go to a single stop shopping and get multiple government services in one place. These are all seen as mechanisms by which to grow transparency and improve services in Mongolia. And so these are areas the US government, the US Agency for International Development, cooperative entities like the Mongolian Compact. All of those have had an aspect of seeking to use technology to improve service delivery and reduce corruption. I think the fact that Mongolia is a very young, not only is it a young country, it is a young population. It is a population which sort of did that digital jump because it sort of straight into cell phones. And so I don't know what the figures are today, but cell phone usage in Mongolia was sort of extraordinarily high even 10 years ago, 10 years ago when I was there. So I should say also in that sort of in the same space, it's a very vibrant social media. I mentioned that before. So I think there's a real hope that e-commerce, that social media, and the use of technology are all ways to fight corruption in Mongolia.
All right, we have 2 questions here about future electoral prospects. So I'll try to merge them together here. So generally speaking, what do you think are the circumstances or likelihood that the Democratic Party would either regain power or increase its share of seats, or for smaller parties to increase their share of seats in the parliament, the state great total in 2024? And then one of the questions talks about expanding on that and saying whether or not the government is able to amend the electoral system prior to that 2024 election or not.
Yeah, so I mentioned that one of the dynamics of the 2020 parliamentary election, which we then also saw play out in the 2021 presidential election, was a fracturing within the Democratic Party. And so a number of sort of own goals, problems that they brought on themselves. And unfortunately, sitting here in mid-2021, looking at the Democratic Party, I would not assess that they had fully digested the lessons of how counterproductive that sort of internal strife is if you're trying to consolidate your party and present a united and compelling front. And for that reason, I'm agnostic between the Mongolian People's Party and the Democratic Party in terms of, it's not a situation where I personally have a preference for one party over the other. I want to make that really clear. What I would like to see is a system where there are at least 2, if not 2 strong parties and the possibility of some small parties having a real voice in a coalition government. My concern is I want to see Mongolia move back into a vibrant two plus party system where there is an effective opposition, which among other things has a strong enough voice in parliament to be a player in parliament, and where an opposition party is able to hold the party that is the party that's in power to account. So that's my goal for the system, whether it's the Democratic Party or some of the other fledgling parties that were mentioned. I'm not optimistic. And if there's anybody from the Democratic Party or listening, I would just say you need to get your own house in order to be an effective, in order to be a more effective opposition.
Then it is 3:52, so I think we have time for one, maybe two questions more if they're relatively quick. So another one from the audience is, what do you think the United States can do to strengthen its diplomatic relationship with Mongolia? And then the second part of that question is, would a good first step be to re-up the third neighbor trade policy in 2023, or do you think the United States needs to provide more investment and support within Mongolia itself?
So I would love to see us move forward on creating some preferential trade, a preferential trade system for Mongolia. I think something along the lines of the third neighbor trade policy, which hasn't moved forward in Congress yet. I think that when I was ambassador, an area of real focus for us was recognizing that our relationship with Mongolia had matured. In the first 10, 15 years, it was very much a strong development support and support for Mongolia developing its democracy. As we moved into the next decade of our relationship, it was time to move into a more parallel, a more respectful relationship. And therefore, the shift to the Mongolian compacts, the MCC compacts, increased the effort to increase trade, the effort to increase the military ties, was all about that recalibrating the relationship into being a more mature relationship. And I think to strengthen the trade element of that would be a really important and positive way to move forward. And also, again, and this is so important for Mongolia, open up markets outside of China and Russia. Because as we've discussed, the economic reliance on Russia for energy and the reliance on China as the purchaser of such a large percent of Mongolia's output, both of those create concerns, obligations, reliances of Mongolia on their neighbors. And so anything that the United States can do to support Mongolia's expansion of its trade and economic connections, I think would be an extremely positive thing. This is a difficult environment in which to move any trade-related legislation, however.
Okay, and then I think our last question, I know we're coming up pretty much to the end. So maybe a quick answer to this one is just, what about, we talked about, political alignments with other countries, but this question is, what about potential Democratic Party alignment, parentheses, with either faction, I guess, either faction within the party with Russia today?
So I'm not entirely sure I understand the question.
So I think the question is
DP alignment with Russia. Okay,
yeah.
So yeah, there are the factions within the Democratic Party are both, the leaders of both the factions are seen as being somewhat more Western oriented. And I haven't seen anything in the news recently which suggests that either of those factions are leaning more towards Russia. I should mention that a Russian military vehicle actually transited Mongolia within the last month, which was unusual to say the least. And my understanding is that that generated a very strong outcry from Mongolians across the political spectrum. And there was a real feeling that that had been meant by Russia to be a very overt and non-subtle. It was described as a mistake of some sort, but was really seen as a threat. And that's really, if you look at Mongolian social media, that's really energized the youth.
All right, well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. So first, I'd like to thank you, Ambassador Campbell, for your expertise and insights and for joining us today. I've really learned a lot just by being here and speaking with you and with our audience. So we were honored to host you, and we really appreciate the time that you've taken out of your busy schedule today to join us and deliver your perspective and expertise on Mongolia and its politics. And even though we're out of time, we present the opportunity for those tuning in with interest in US-Asia relations, or to reach out to the US-Asia Institute if they have questions we didn't get to, or that you'd like to ask on this briefing or any future briefings. So if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with us, please reach out to us at USAI@USAsiaInstitute.org, and we would be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues that we discussed today. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much. This was I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.